for Thunder Bay, Superior North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tonight I want to talk about the state of this House. Let's face it, Canadian democracy is in deep trouble, especially since the current government came to power. It's not just the Conservatives, though, that are responsible for the mess we're in. The leaders of the Liberal and the NDP are more interested in crushing dissent within their parties than encouraging debate. MPs are often forced to vote against their conscience and against the will of their constituents. Anti-democratic attitudes abound in party back rooms. For the last year, we've been discussing the member for Wellington Halton Hills proposed Reform Act. I truly believe that with this Reform Act in its current form, we have an opportunity to transform Canadian democracy for the better. So you can imagine my disappointment, but not surprised, when the three main parties have waffled on their positions and criticized parts of this important bill. Canadians want change, Mr. Speaker. They want democracy restored. The groundswell of support from ordinary Canadians for this bill is significant, Mr. Speaker. Everyone I've spoken to has told me they are calling on their MPs to support this important legislation. This Reform Act makes some long overdue changes that will make Parliament work better for Canadians, again, instead of party leaders. It would make party leaders more accountable to their MPs by establishing a leadership review process. And it will end, Mr. Speaker, the requirement for a candidate's nomination papers to be signed by the party leader, the anti-democratic but little-known change to the Elections Act made by Pierre Trudeau in 1970. This reform will empower MPs to once again stand up for their constituents. It's the primary reason why I'm supporting this bill in its current form. I even introduced a similar motion back in 2012. The Reform Act is important because it scales back the excessive powers of party leaders and restores local control over party nominations. But recently, changes were proposed, I can only assume to placate party leaders, that will weaken the most important parts of this bill and hand endorsement power right back to party leaders. The Reform Act is only the beginning for democratic reform. Several other changes must be made to make Parliament more productive and less partisan. We must make our voting system more proportional to reflect the actual choices of Canadians. We must increase cross-party cooperation to end mindless partisan tribalism, and we must take away the Prime Minister's power to declare any bill a matter of confidence and stop him from bullying Parliament, imposing bloated omnibus budget bills, and ignoring his own fixed election date. It's time we prevented parties from forcing their MPs to vote with their party. The Green Party unanimously passed this summer a resolution to ensure that MPs would always be free to vote independently. We must also restrict the Prime Minister's unilateral power to appoint, without any oversight, senators, judges, parliamentary officers, and many other positions. The Reform Act, Mr. Speaker, in its current form is a step in the right direction. I urge my colleagues to recognize that it's time for all MPs who care about democracy to re-empower themselves and support the Reform Act in its current form without weakening it further. Will Conservative MPs, and indeed all the MPs in this House, have the courage to vote for the Reform Act in its current form? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his intervention. This may be a brief response, not because it's not an important issue, but because it is. Democratic reform is a very serious and difficult task, and I begin by commending the member from Wellington Halton Hills for his important work in strengthening our democratic institutions and bringing forward the Reform Act. The Reform Act is an effort to strengthen Canada's democratic institutions by restoring the role of elected members of Parliament in the House of Commons. Now, the member opposite said in his original question that the leaders of the three major parties threatened to kill the bill if it is not watered down. But I would like to point out that, as with all private members' business, we said we would take time to carefully review the amendments proposed by the member to his own bill. The Reform Act Bill C-586 has now been read a second time and has been referred to committee where it currently is right now. Now, of course, the committee is the master of its own destiny, but the honourable member from Wellington Halton Hills proposed two changes in response to consultations held over the summer and to build support for his bill. The first is that he concluded that perhaps the way it was written with respect to party nominations was too prescriptive, that making it difficult for parties, for example, to meet diversity targets. In fact, the member opposite is from a party where there's exactly 50% male and 50% female here in the House of Commons, but other parties have not reached that target yet. And so the amendments that the member from Wellington Halton Hills has proposed is that instead of insisting that it only be a local decision in terms of who signs nomination papers, that the party could determine who it is, other than who it is that would sign these nomination papers. Now, that could be somebody locally, that could even be the leader, but it would not be prescribed to be the leader as is currently in the current Canada Elections Act. The second change that he is proposing is that each House of Commons caucus, after every general election, as its first item of business in a recorded manner, could vote on whether they wanted to kind of accept the template that's laid out in his bill or a different set of rules, and they would have that freedom to do so. But quite simply, the bill takes the current unwritten convention and makes explicit in statute the rules and process for caucus to review the party leader. Additionally, the Reform Act proposes that a party leadership review may be initiated by the submission of a written notice to the caucus chair signed by at least 20% of the caucus members, and mandates that the caucus chair make public the names of those caucus members requesting the vote. When a majority of caucus members vote in favor of a leadership review, a second vote by secret ballot occurs immediately to select a person to serve as the interim party leader until a new party leader has been elected. Mr. Speaker, our government has continually delivered on its democratic reform commitments. More backbench MPs have passed bills into law through this majority Conservative Parliament than under any government since 1972, and we still have a year to go. And I should add, Mr. Speaker, that the Globe and Mail analysed 162,000 votes over almost 2 years and found that Conservative MPs are far more likely to vote independently from their party than opposition MPs, as opposed to the NDP, for example, which found that in those votes not a single MP voted against the party line. So as the member opposite knows, the Prime Minister and our government supported the bill, and as it comes back from committee, this House will have the privilege to examine the bill again at third reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Thunder Bay Superior North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to commend the member opposite on his thoughtful comments tonight. Logical, clear. I don't agree with them, many of them, but it was a cut above the average that I hear sometimes in this House. But, Mr. Speaker, I really don't understand why some Liberal, NDP, and Conservative MPs are fearing supporting the Reform Act in its current form and want to weaken it further. As elected representatives of our constituents who have expressed a clear preference for the current bill, I would hope that all members will think long and hard before trying to water down a bill of this importance. The current version of the Reform Act will re-empower MPs and get them once again working for our constituents rather than for unelected backroom apparatchiks. It will allow MPs to put the needs of Canadians ahead of narrow party interests. While I'll support the bill in its current form as an important step forward, I'll have to think about it if it is significantly watered down as changes are made later. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask, will all MPs in this House support the current version of the Reform Act and restore democracy to the House of Commons? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the additional comments. I think the member from Wellington Halton Hills has actually demonstrated for all of us, an effective approach to doing business in this place. After he produced his bill and it was in the public domain, He indicated that he welcomed suggestions to improve this bill to make it more palatable to a broader number of members and so on. And in fact, that's what he's done. And as with all private members' business, we said we would take time to carefully review the amendments that have been proposed by the member. These amendments would keep parties in control of their nominations and allow caucuses to set their own rules. And in light of these proposed changes, the government supported Bill C-586 at second reading and look forward to seeing it when it comes back from committee.